What is up, guys, and welcome to another episode of Guarani Vision, the first ever podcast dedicated to Paraguayan football in English. As always, I'm Roberto Rojas, and joining me as always are my two great co-hosts, Ralph Hanna and Maria Britos. And guys, at the time of recording, today is the day, the start of a new Premier League season, the 31st Premier League season in its existence. And obviously, as we've been doing over our last two episodes, we're going to dive into what our Paraguayan players will be doing this season, and what better way to have been able to speak about maybe the most important Paraguayan player, not just playing in the Premier League, but I think on the team so far, in Miguel Almiron of Newcastle, with our very special guest, Chris Waugh from The Athletic. But before we get to Chris here and dive into our discussion, let me get my two co-hosts in here. Ralph, I mean, obviously you are an Arsenal fan. Obviously, we were talking just before the show of how pessimistic you might be, as a lot of Arsenal fans typically are, especially before their game against Crystal Palace. But besides the whole gunner pessimistic and all that, I think we have to feel a bit optimistic from a Geordie standpoint because, you know, obviously this is a new look Newcastle, and especially with our Paraguayan representative in Miggy, I mean, there is a way to feel a bit hopeful out of all the Paraguayan players that are playing in the Premier League this season.
Yeah, thanks, Roberto. I came with my black and white. I tried to find something black and white for this, which for Chris's benefit in Paraguay, that can be very controversial because it's Olimpia, one of the biggest teams there, and of course Almiron came through Cerro. He came through their arch rival. But yeah, it's really an exciting season, I think, for Newcastle and for Almiron, as I guess we'll get into it, because we thought he was going to be a bit of a fringe player. He seemed to kind of get his way back into the team and back into Eddie Howe's favor. So I think of the three players, well, now Ojeda has of course gone off on loan to the MLS since the last time we spoke about him. So of the two players in the Premier League, I think, of course, Almiron's going to get more game time than Enciso this year at least. So he's the player that we've all been hoping for the national team, that can also be kind of sparking them into life and trying to get them into World Cup qualification. And he's still got time left. I'm sure he'll be involved in the next cycle as well. So definitely the kind of the key man, I think, when we think about Paraguayan football right now.
Absolutely. And I think this is going to be very much a season that I think a lot of eyes will be on Miggy, especially with this new look Newcastle. And Maria, I'll go to you on this one, because I think, you know, this has been a player that's kind of divided opinion, not just in Newcastle, but I think in Paraguay as a whole. As you know, what Ralph said, you know, he isn't becoming the player that we expected to be on the national team. But ironically so, as we've seen over the last few months, including the friendlies that he played for Paraguay and of course for Newcastle, he's been quite on form, actually, you know, scoring a couple goals, providing a couple assists. He's been basically playing very much well under Guillermo Barros-Schelotto on the national team, and then under Eddie Howe for Newcastle. So you would think that maybe this season could indeed be different, and we could finally see the Almiron that we've been waiting for quite some time.
Yes, that's true. Hey guys, good morning here and good afternoon over there to Chris. Yeah, it's gonna be, I think, a much better, well, in my opinion, I think it's gonna be a much better season for Miggy. He looks like he's doing a much better job training, you know, getting ready for this new season. And I think that's his only option, you know. He's been kind of like in the backstage all this time, trying to get that, you know, that starting position for Newcastle, and he hasn't been able to get that chance. You know, I think that he understands that this is his chance now to really show what he's really worth, what he did in Atlanta United, and what we know that he's capable of. So yeah, and that's gonna be one of my questions for Chris later on. So I'm ready to get this started.
Absolutely. And here we have Chris here. And before we get obviously into this discussion with Miggy, obviously we like to introduce our guest and get a little bit of a background about, you know, their kind of connection with Newcastle. So, you know, obviously, for lack of better words, Chris, I mean, what is your connection with Newcastle? And, you know, I guess to start off here, what are your expectations for Newcastle this season? And really, what is a new look Newcastle under new ownership? Obviously, the first full season under new ownership and the first new season under Eddie Howe.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on, guys. I was born and raised in Newcastle, so I've lived here most of my life, other than going away for university and to work. And then I've covered the club professionally since 2015. So first I did it for the Chronicle and Journal, local newspapers, and since the Athletic launched in the UK in 2019, I've been the Newcastle United correspondent there. In terms of this season and expectations, I think that a lot of fans are very excited and very much looking forward to a campaign where, for the first time in probably 15 years, they don't fear relegation immediately going into it. Hopefully, those fears, it's not misplaced that fear is gone and that they are able to push on from here. But there is still a little bit of a disconnect, I think, externally as to what this Newcastle project is and how people perceive it to be. In terms of Eddie Howe, we spoke to this morning, and he was clear that FFP remains an issue for Newcastle in terms of financial fair play expenditure. They can't just spend their way in order an amount in the short term to get to where they want to be. It is going to be a process that they want to get to the very top, but because of financial fair play restrictions, they can't just do that all in the short term. And so I think that progress from last season would be a comfortable top 10 finish, have a good go at the Cups, maybe an outside chance of getting into Europe. But in terms of Newcastle really pushing on and carrying on the top four form, which they showed for large parts of the first half of 2022 to lift themselves out of the relegation zone and further on, I think that was them overperforming. And really, given that they haven't actually made any attacking reinforcements yet this summer, I think a comfortable top 10 finish is really a realistic aim.
Thanks, Chris. That was more moderate than I expected. I thought you're going all in for Europe. And we're actually, speaking of Europe just quickly, we only have one Paraguayan representative in UEFA competition at the moment this year, which is Blas Riveros in Denmark. So I think we're really hoping that Newcastle can push on, so we see Almiron in there and kind of at the higher level of competition, because in terms of when we think about the national team, that's something Paraguay are missing. But going into my first question for you, Almiron can be he's quite a difficult player to kind of put in a box, I suppose, in terms of what his position is, because he's very fast. When he came through at Cerro, I remember they played him kind of on the left wing. Then as he got more senior, he got more central. But sometimes he seems a bit limited technically to be a 10. And so he ends up getting moved around and used a lot. So I wanted to get your opinion on where do you think Eddie has found the best role for him, and where do you think we'll see him play this season?
Yeah, Newcastle, it's been a big question mark as well as to what is Almiron's best position. When he first came in, he played in a front three under Rafa Benitez, where he was sort of it was a front three, but it was almost like having two number 10s just behind Salomon Rondon. So it was him and Jose Perez playing just off, and he had a bit of a free role, and he performed very well there. He didn't score, get the assists, but really he gave Newcastle a new attacking dimension. Then when Steve Bruce came in, he was shifted a lot, played a lot on the right, which he hadn't done that much previously, out as an out-and-out winger, really, often in a system where Newcastle was sitting low block, and he was one of the wide players alongside Alan Saint-Maximin, and you get the ball very deep and be expected to carry it upfield. Eddie Howe, and then also under Bruce, he probably played his best football under Bruce on the rare occasions Newcastle switched to like a 4-2-3-1, and he played as an out-and-out number 10, and he did look far better. He just didn't get long runs in that position. Eddie Howe hasn't really played with number 10s very much. His system tends to be 4-3-3. Now, that's why he's had success anyway at Newcastle, and Almiron is more often than not featured on the right. Alan Saint-Maximin is the first choice left-sided player. Fraser is probably second choice left-sided player. And then Almiron got into the team after Fraser, who had been playing on the right, was injured, and he performed really well towards the end last season, scored one really good goal against Crystal Palace. But what he really excels at, and what I think Howe likes from him, is the fact that he can lead the press. He's got so much energy that he's very good at harrying the opposition. And I think that we saw the best of Almiron off the ball towards the end of last season. We didn't necessarily yet see, hopefully, what he can do with the ball, but you can see why it would be important to what Eddie Howe would want in terms of the way that Howe wants his teams to play. He's a coach who demands a heck of a lot of his players. out of possession is a very basic, and Almiron is someone who is very, very good at that. And he's one of the rare players at Newcastle who actually has pace. Beyond him and Alan Saint-Maximin, there isn't much pace in the team. And so to have Almiron's pace is a huge benefit.
Yeah, it's worth noting he played, of course, under Tata Martino in Atlanta, who's a kind of a disciple of Bielsa. So that kind of pressing and off the ball movement, I'm sure he picked up a lot there. Just one more question before I throw it over to Maria, is in terms of his personality. He seems, well, we all love him in Paraguay, and he did have one radio interview where he decided to turn on some of the senior players in the national team, which was quite surprising. But generally, he's a very happy character, always smiling, and he seems to be very well loved, whether he's in the team or not, with Newcastle fans. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, he's a very, very popular player, Almiron. When he came in, it was a point where it was a huge signing and he made an impact initially. But as a character, I mean, everyone talks about is that smile, that infectious smile that Miggy always has, that everyone who sees him. And so he really is, there's a big connection there that was built really when he arrived, and War Flags had the banner welcoming him in Spanish. And obviously he was very pleased with that. And even though his English isn't brilliant, and he doesn't do interviews very often in English, he usually turns them down because he's still not confident enough in it, despite having been at the US before he was here. He has built up that real rapport with Newcastle fans. I think it's almost because its main form of communication with them is to basically he has this smile where he smiles at them, and it's celebrations during games, and just also that attitude that he has, that you can see that he gives everything out on the pitch. And although a lot of people will use the cliche, that's a basic requirement. In the Premier League, it's not always the case. And if you have a player who you can see is running themselves into the ground for the cause, as Almiron does, then he'll always be accepted. He's never really complained, despite being shifted from position to position. He's not someone who seems to have that really arrogant side about him. He seems to be very down to earth. And so, yeah, he really is a very, very popular among the Newcastle fan base.
Well, I wanted to thank you again, Chris, for allowing us to talk to you today. But fun fact about Paraguayans, I think we are very well known for our, I guess, big smile, being friendly all the time, just being an overall great people, I think. So I guess that's where Almiron gets it from, and that's why he's very well loved. And I think that's great for him. The fact that he still has the fans on his hands. Being able to, even though he doesn't communicate as much as you say, he still is very well loved in the club, and I think that's very important for his future. So I wanted to ask you, there was an interview recently with Almiron, and he was talking about the confidence that he feels now, especially now in preseason. He had a few great games, scored in a lot of them, and he thanked his coach Eddie Howe for the confidence that he's been putting on him, and that has been helping him to become a better player. Why do you think that is? What do you think Eddie Howe sees in Almiron now that other coaches didn't?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think that part of it is giving Almiron a very specific role. When he first came in with Rafa Benitez, as I said earlier, he had a defined role. He was part of a front three, and it was clear what was being asked of him. He was the one who had to break in behind and basically stretch the opposition defense and create space for the opposition. Also off the ball, he had a very specific role. I think under the previous manager, Steve Bruce, it's fair to say that there wasn't quite as defined a role in exactly what was expected of Miguel Almiron in terms of where he was expected to be off the ball, what it was he was meant to contribute to the team. And he strikes me as a player, and this is also based on having spoken to people at Newcastle or elsewhere about him, that he likes to have that sort of clear direction of what he is being asked to do. What is my role in the team? What exactly am I bringing? And Eddie Howe and his coaching staff are sticklers for detail. They want to impart that specific information. They ask very specific things of players. And when Almiron's been in the team, Howe is stressed to him, don't worry too much about the numbers. Obviously, he wants them to score an assist, but actually, if you do the very basics in terms of what I want, in terms of pressing, in terms of being in these positions, making sure you're here when we have the ball, making sure you're getting in around the box, making sure you're getting on the right-hand side, that will follow. And so rather than saying to him, I need you to score 5-10 goals, this is the plan. This is how we get to that stage of the plan as well. And this is how you fit into it. And I think that he's embraced that. He really likes it. As I say, his pace, Newcastle and a lot of other Newcastle players don't have as much pace as Almiron, and also his ability to press. So I think they're the main reasons he's received that confidence. The goals haven't yet followed. They haven't pre-season. He's had an extremely impressive pre-season, 6 goals. But to translate that into the Premier League is still a big step up. And he hasn't yet been able to do it during his time in Newcastle, to regularly score, to regularly assist. As I mentioned earlier, there are mitigating factors for that. But I still think it'll be, for him to take that step up, that's a big step up for him, having only scored once last season, to really replicate that form. I hope he can do it, and there's so many Newcastle fans are willing him on to do it. But the real concern, I think, for Newcastle, where they are short beyond Callum Wilson going into this season, remains goals. And if there was one position that I expected Newcastle to strengthen, I think Eddie Howe expected to strengthen this summer, it probably was that right wing position, and they haven't yet done that. And that's why Almiron may well get the chance to prove that he can translate that form into the start of the Premier League season.
And still speaking about the future, last season, I think that there was a lot of strong rumors of, Almiron leaving to another club. There was a lot of talk of him, not being happy there. But what do you think? Obviously we want him to stay, but do you think that in the future he has a chance of leaving somewhere else? And do you think, at this time he seems very happy there, but anything can change, and sometimes money speaks. But what do you think his future could be like in the next few seasons?
There has been doubt over Almiron's future at Newcastle, and I think that if they had signed more attacking reinforcements by now this summer, then there would have been even bigger question marks. But those players haven't yet arrived. Almiron has taken his chance in pre-season, and so I would be surprised if he doesn't start on the right-hand side against Nottingham Forest. As I say, there are characteristics that Howe really likes him, and I think as even if he wasn't always going to be a starter going forward, I think the ability to, now Newcastle and other Premier League teams can have 5 players who come on off the bench. If you can bring on someone with Almiron's pace and ability to press late in matches, that will be important. But given the age that he's at, he's now in his late 20s. In terms of his actual status within the squad, I think that it's a very important few months for Almiron to really prove that he should be part of it going forward, because as I say, under the previous manager, I think there was a decent chance he would have left. I don't think he was particularly happy with what Newcastle was, and also with how he was being used and where he was playing. That has changed under Eddie Howe, but Newcastle as a club are trying to progress. They're trying to move on, and Almiron has to show he can be part of that. He has a high release clause, which is part of the reason why I don't think that really any club out there was ever going to get close to matching that. And I think that some of the noise around him potentially leaving hasn't quite matched the reality, because Newcastle will want their money back if they do sell Miguel Almiron. And the likelihood is he would probably go abroad somewhere else in Europe if he did leave. And the Premier League has such a higher financial capacity than a lot of other can other clubs afford him? Can clubs in Spain, where I think you'd ideally like to go, afford him? In the short term, I think probably not. But as I say, I think the next 3 or 4 months are very, very important for Almiron to prove that he should stay at Newcastle United longer, that he deserves a place than longer than maybe just the first 6 months or next season even.
And certainly this is obviously going to be a very important next 3-4 months, not just for Mickey, but also for Newcastle. Just looking ahead at their schedule, obviously they will open tomorrow at the time of recording against Nottingham Forest before taking on another Paraguayan on this team in Brighton Hove Albion, before taking on Man City, Wolves, and Liverpool to match up the first 5 matches in August. So just more of a question in terms of expectations again for Newcastle, because I think, I think a lot of us really are going to be expecting on this Newcastle side, especially with a lot of changes being made, with now this kind of financial surplus with the new ownership, obviously with Eddie Howe's kind of plan and really what he wants to view as success for Newcastle. So I just want your thoughts on, maybe for those who have been following Newcastle from Paraguay, who have been able to see Miggy play for I think 100 times or something like that, 110 games for Newcastle so far, which is incredible. He is the player with the most appearances on a Premier League team. So just, your overall thoughts on really what to expect from this Newcastle side from a fan standpoint, for those maybe that have been used to seeing them. And just, for Miggy's case, what would you view as success for him for this season?
Yeah, well, I think with Newcastle in general, you are going to see a team who's probably going to have more of the ball than they have done in recent seasons. I don't think they're necessarily going to dominate possession every week, but they want to be a side who, rather than almost wanting to have far less of the ball in the opposition and just get them on the counter, I think they want to mix it up a little bit, and certainly at St. James's have a bit more possession, play with a higher defensive line, play it out through the lines and from the back. And so that is really what Howe wants to impart in terms of his philosophy on the team. He came in November last year as head coach. The priority was on keeping Newcastle up. This has been his first pre-season where he's been able to impart those ideas. And I think that you will see evolution in the way that they play. How that affects Almiron, I think he has to chip in with more goals. A successful season, in my view, would see him maybe reach double figures for goals and assists combined. That is a minimum, really, because beyond Callum Wilson and to a lesser extent Alan St-Maximin, Newcastle don't have enough goals in this team. Almiron has shown in the past, in MLS certainly, that he can provide that. At Newcastle, he's flattered to deceive at times. He hasn't quite taken his opportunity, and in front of goal, he hasn't always looked particularly confident. In pre-season, he's looked very confident. So if he can carry some of that into the season, and given that I think certainly at home matches Newcastle will create opportunities, I think that he has the chance to really actually make this the season where he produces the numbers everyone expected him to when he first came in, because quite often his performances and his numbers haven't quite married up. Over maybe his last season until the last couple of months of the season, he didn't quite perform. Whereas this year, I do think that there is a chance of that. I controversially didn't select him in my starting 11 for the start of the season, which I'm sure everyone listening to this will be very angry at, but I didn't. And part of my reason for that is that he hasn't produced yet for Newcastle. He has in pre-season, and I want nothing more than Miguel Almiron to start tomorrow, score, and completely prove me wrong, and then go on a run, because he has all of the component parts to be a success. It just hasn't really quite added up with the numbers yet.
And yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of us are going to be expectant on this Newcastle side and really are hopeful, I would say, Chris, because, this is a side that many people are predicting could indeed fight for those European spots, could indeed be a side that people are sleeping on, like what we say, a sleeper pick or a dark horse really to make those European sides. But, it's obviously the first day of the Premier League season. We're big fans of doing predictions on this show, and I love always doing it. So I'm going to put you on the hot seat now, Chris. Where do you feel as if Newcastle will finish this season?
Very difficult question to answer, but I'm going to go for, I think about 8th or 9th is where I think there can be. I do think there will be top 10. I don't quite think they're ready yet to break into the sort of top 6, maybe even 7. But I think that they will put themselves in the conversations for those very lower European positions. If they added a forward between now and the end of the window, I think they'd give themselves a better chance just in terms of goals. But yeah, I do think that given the progress under Eddie Howe so far and given the solidity of their defence, I'm going to go 9th.
I think that would be a respectable case for Newcastle. I think obviously for a lot of fans who have been accustomed to seeing Newcastle fighting into those relegation spots, heading into a top table finish would be exceeding expectations. And we're going to have to wait and see what happens to Newcastle and what happens to Mickey, as we hope that, as kind of the main flag bearer for the national team and really representing all Paraguayans across the world, that he's able to show his best football playing in the best league in the world. So Chris, thank you again for coming on. It was a real pleasure for you to talk about Miggy and to talk about Newcastle as we wrap up another great episode of Guarani Vision. For myself, Roberto Rojas, Ralph Hanna, and Maria Britos, thank you so much for listening in. See you soon.